Okay, so we're recording now. Thank you everybody who is coming in at the moment. My name is Beth and I am the tour and volunteer manager for the Friends of Laurel Hill. We have with us Dr. Joe Lex, who is a tour guide for the Friends of Laurel Hill. And you are all here tonight because Julia from Oakwell and Stoneleigh asked for the Friends to put together, and Joe did a lovely job that you'll see tonight, of all of the, not inclusive, not all, but many of the connections that deceased residents of Laurel Hill East and Laurel Hill West have in common with your organization and your historic site. So I know Joe did a lot of work to do this presentation tonight. My role tonight will just be kind of a facilitator. I'll be behind the scenes. Once I'm done talking, I'll turn off my camera, I'll mute myself, and I'll be the one that is taking a look at the Q&A function. If you're not familiar with Zoom webinars, they're a little bit different than meetings in that you can only see and hear us panelists. So myself, Joe, and Julia in a little bit are the only ones who you can see and hear. But if you have any questions at all as we're going along through the presentation, at the bottom of your screen, there is, it says Q&A and it has two little speech bubbles. You can open that up and you can type in a question or a comment. And we'll have a break midway through the presentation that we can get to some of those questions that were asked during the first portion. And then during the second portion, we'll answer those questions at the end. So you can put those through there. Other than that, I think that's all I have. I am going to, before we pass it along to Joe to introduce himself, I'm going to pass this to Julia, who has some welcome remarks for you.
Welcome. Thank you for joining the Oakwell movement for tonight's presentation, The Bones of Stoneleigh and Oakwell. My name is Julia Agnew. I've been working with the students and community members to raise awareness about the rich history of the Oakwell estate. That rich history has been hiding in historical records, newspapers, maps, family photographs for the past century. But it burst into the public eye in 2019 when Lower Merion School District purchased the property as a future location for auxiliary athletic fields for a new nearby middle school. This is why wherever you drive in Lower Merion today, you see red lawn signs saying Save and Preserve Oakwell. You may recall the Save Stoneleigh campaign that preceded this, when the district sought to use eminent domain to place those fields at Stoneleigh, then owned by Natural Lands, and a tremendous opposition campaign combined with legislation to protect Stoneleigh. So fast forward, February of 2022, when a member of our community began researching more deeply the structures and people associated with Oakwell and the Stoneleigh property on which it was built. What was discovered was that the story of a Philadelphia family who lived on this property at the turn of the century, the Bodine family, Eleanor and Samuel T. Bodine, and their children. The Bodines were very much connected to the arts and the horticultural scenes that were blossoming both downtown and in our area, as many prominent figures were building homes and moving their families to the main line. The Bodines were innovative and philanthropic. One fact we got pretty excited about is that over 100 years ago, Eleanor Bodine used their one-of-a-kind Frank Miles Day and Olmsted designed garden complex to house a gardening and horticultural training program for young women. They used the sprawling fruit and vegetable gardens to feed the community during and after the First World War, Victory Gardens, part of a network of 400 acres of these community war gardens from Marion to Villanova. So we and the students involved in the Oakwell movement jumped on these findings, and quickly it became our goal to see the site once again used for innovative educational programming. The students put together a comprehensive proposal for the school district, and rather than just imagine uses for this property, The Oakwell movement has been making it happen. And every time we envision how Oakwell could serve as a teaching tool, our creative imaginings seem to lead to great things. Our first effort was to create the Grow Oakwell website to share our research. The site houses an enormous amount of information with primary sources and links galore. The site tells the story of Oakwell, the development of our local community, and more broadly, American civilization. After compiling this work, we thought, why not submit it to the state and try to get it on the National Register? So we did. This February 2023, the Pennsylvania State Historic Preservation Office considered our mighty long submission and shared our excitement about our findings, deeming not just Oakwell, but Oakwell and Stoneleigh eligible as a district for the National Register of Historic Places. And this is a pretty big deal in the preservation world. Another effort to show the ways Oakwell can be a teaching tool took place last week. We hosted a bio blitz, which brought together scientific experts from many different institutions and schools with community members of all ages to inventory species on the 13.4 acres. And over 470 unique species were recorded. But it wasn't just the number of species that was impressive. It was the dialogue about these species, the sharing of that expertise, and the observers, the students soaking it all up that day that made for such a magical educational experience. So the experience of researching and following clues down rabbit holes has been a bit of a magical mystery tour, leading us to university and museum archives, historic places, and cemeteries. And that's how we learned about Dr. Joe Lex. He too likes history, education, storytelling, and cemeteries. Now, in the course of our Oakwell research adventures, we've also made an unusually large number of cold calls, attempting to solicit expertise and advocacy. Needless to say, we've been on the receiving end of many hangups, but not from Dr. Joe Lex. He listened and did not question my sanity, I don't think. He was 100% supportive of our cause, as excited as we were about all of the connections between artists, architects, and oil giants, and incredibly generous with his time. I know it took weeks to prepare for this night, for which we are so grateful. So, tonight, with the help of the wonderful Beth from Friends of Laurel Hill, we bring you Dr. Joe Lex for another sure to be fabulous learning experience. Take it away, Joe.
There we go. Am I audible? Okay. Hi, I am Joe Lex. I'm a retired professor of emergency medicine from Temple University. I retired in 2016 and realized right away what I missed a lot was research and teaching. And at the time, I had just started going to tours at Laurel Hill Cemetery. And I said, you know, research and teaching is exactly what they're doing here. So I trained and I became a guide. I'm now a certified guide at both Laurel Hill East and Laurel Hill West. They had a name change recently, by the way. If you're used to hearing the terms Laurel Hill Cemetery and West Laurel Hill Cemetery, they're now combined together. It's now Laurel Hill East and Laurel Hill West. And I missed research and teaching, so I started to become a guide. And then I decided to do a podcast. And when I was offered the opportunity to do this, I jumped at the opportunity because I knew there were going to be a lot of connections between the cemeteries and Oakwell and Stoneleigh. And that's what I'm going to talk about, is the connections. And it's going to go down a couple of rabbit holes. I'm going to avoid some other rabbit holes. I'll show you where I avoid the rabbit holes. And some of the connections are going to go a second degree or even a third degree. You'll see as we get into this. You are going to get a crash course in late 19th century history. And we're going to bounce around a lot. And just like that, there we go. There goes my little bouncy cat. We're going to bounce around a lot. You have to understand, I have a passion for these cemeteries like you do for Oakwell and Stoneleigh. I want to show you these deep links between Laurel Hill East and West, the growth and development of Philadelphia. There are connections everywhere. Now, I mentioned a podcast. I'll put this up for now. I will put it up at the end also. But this will take you straight to the podcast site. It's called All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories. There are about 70 podcasts out now that are biographies of people buried at the two cemeteries. I have not done the three main people I'm going to talk about today, but now I know I definitely have to do a podcast on UGI, on United Gas Improvement. These are the podcasts, All Bones Considered, Biographical Bytes from Bala. When you see an ABC or a BBB come up on the right side of the screen, there will be a number with it. And that will tell you the podcast that talks about the person who's on that slide that we're looking at that time. Start with the basics. Like I say, crash course in 19th century Philadelphia history. 1850 census. This is Philadelphia, river to river and Arch Street to South Street. Fourth most populous city in the United States. However, ninth most populous is Spring Garden, 11th is Northern Liberties, 12th is Kensington, 20th is Southwark. It was not until 1854 that there was a consolidation. I'll get to that in a second. This, if you are not familiar with Laurel Hill East, is what Laurel Hill East looks like. It used to just be called Laurel Hill Cemetery. But when you hear me talking about Laurel Hill North, it's this section with the main entrance, Laurel Hill Central, and Laurel Hill South. This is the consolidation. In 1854, everything in Philadelphia County became the city of Philadelphia. 13 townships, 6 boroughs, 9 districts, and the census went from 93,000 in 1840 to 565,000 by 1860 after the consolidation. The size went from a very comfortable 2 square miles. There's something called Marchetti's Law. Marchetti determined that people are comfortable if they live within 30 minutes of where they work. And in mid-19th century Philadelphia, which was a 3-mile-per-hour lifestyle, either walking or horses, that was it. Everything in that little 2-mile rectangle was within 30 minutes. Now, with transportation improving, suddenly the city of Philadelphia is 130 square miles. This is Laurel Hill West. As you can see at this time, this is an older map. It shows you that it was served by the Pennsylvania Railroad here, coming up to the Barmouth Station, and the Reading Railroad here, coming up to the Pencoid Station, right at the Pencoid Iron Works. Laurel Hill West is right next to Westminster Cemetery. This is Belmont Avenue. You'll recognize some other things. I'll show you some other maps in a few minutes as we go through this. And this is just more of a representation of what Laurel Hill West looks like right now. These are the 3 people that I'm going to concentrate on today. Edward Smith, and I just realized it's Edmund Smith. I don't know, typo. I looked at these slides so many times, and there's a typo right there. Edmund Smith and the Pennsylvania Railroad, Frank Miles Day, architect, and Samuel Bodine, and gas. Lots and lots of connections. So let's get started. This is where Edmund Smith is buried. He's in the south section of Laurel Hill East, between Kelly Drive here and Ridge Avenue here. His father is Robert Hobart Smith, mother Mary Potts Smith. They were married in 1813. They are buried in the family vault. There is an underground vault underneath this tablet stone where all of the Smiths are buried. Well, this section of the family is buried anyway. His grandfather is Robert Hubert Smith, 1752 to 1838, who was married to Rebecca Hobart Potts, 1760 to 1802. They're buried at Christ Church, and you don't get more Philadelphia than being buried at Christ Church. Several signers of the Declaration of Independence buried there. One of the few historic cemeteries more historic than Laurel Hill. Edmund's uncle, who was also his mother's younger brother, was John Henry Hobart. He lived from 1773 to 1830. He was the Episcopal Bishop of New York from 1816 to 1830. He actually has a feast day in the Episcopal Church on September 12th. He's buried inside the church at Trinity Churchyard in Manhattan, down at Trinity and Wall Street, which is a real nice historic cemetery to visit. We had a field trip there a few years ago from the Friends of Laurel Hill. Speaking of Wall Street, Edmund's older brother, William Alexander Smith, 1820 to 1911, who is co-owner of the family plot at Laurel Hill East, spent 50 years on the New York Stock Exchange. He was president of the New York Stock Exchange all through the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, and again 1866 and 1867. But he is buried in New York, and the other 5 siblings are all buried in the family plot at Laurel Hill. Now, Edmund married Arabella Barnes. They had 4 children together. Arabella's brother is William Henry Barnes. He was born the same year as Edmund. He's one of the founders of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and he served as director of the Pennsylvania Railroad from 1889 until his death at age 88. Edmund's first job out of Philadelphia High School was in the counting house of Weiss and Skively at 43 North Front Street, which is now a wall to prevent you from falling onto I-95. There's nothing there anymore. In 1847, just after his 18th birthday, he joined Pennsylvania Railroad, which had been established just the year before in 1846. Pennsylvania Railroad's first elected president was this fire engine tycoon, Samuel Von Merrick, 1801 to 1870, who's interred at Laurel Hill East in Section G. S.V. Merrick is one of those invisible people who served as a glue to hold the history of the city together. We are going to encounter him with each person that I talk about, with Smith and Frank Miles Day and Samuel Bodine. He was involved with all of them. Pennsylvania Railroad's second president from September 1849 to February 1852 was Colonel William Chamberlain Patterson, also buried at Laurel Hill East. Now, Edmund's boss was initially Chief Engineer John Edgar Thompson, who is buried at Woodland Cemetery. He rose to be the 3rd president of Pennsylvania Railroad from 1852 to 1874. But it was Thompson and this guy, Army engineer Herman Haupt, who developed the famous horseshoe curve between Harrisburg and Pittsburgh, which opened in 1854. I didn't realize it had been there for that long. Herman Haupt is interred at Laurel Hill West in the Norriton section. He went on to become Abraham Lincoln's railroad man during the Civil War. Edmund started as a rodman until 1852, when he assumed charge of construction of the shops and freight and passenger stations. He was elected secretary of Pennsylvania Railroad in 1855 and served until 1869, when he was chosen as the 3rd vice president. There were a lot of vice presidents in Pennsylvania Railroad. When the Panic and Depression of 1873 hit, they urgently called him back from being 3rd vice president and made him treasurer again to lead them out of the trouble they were in the panic. You have to understand, by November 1873, 55 of the nation's railroads had failed. And in 1 year after this crisis started, another 60 had gone bankrupt. So 115 railroad companies went out of business in this very short period of time. But Edmund, as treasurer, was able to lead Pennsylvania Railroad through this and get them back on the right track. Now, 4 years later is when he bought that property from Ellis Ramsey, 65 acres from Ellis and Mary Ramsey. His new property was quite close to the Harriton estate, which had belonged to founding father Charles Thompson. Charles Thompson was the secretary of the Continental Congress for its entire duration. This is the man who knew where all the bodies were buried. Unfortunately, he destroyed his notes before he died, but the amount of history that this man sat through during the Continental Congress is staggering. Charles Thompson is currently residing in Laurel Hill East, down by the river. He has this obelisk here. There are a lot of rumors about how he got here that sometimes include midnight body snatching, but that is not true. By the way, he also designed the seal of the United States. That was Charles Thompson's work. This is from our archives at the cemetery. That shows we had permission to go pick up the bones of Charles Thompson and his wife and bring them to Laurel Hill. There was no body snatching involved in that at all. Now, in 1882, Smith took over as first vice president of the Pennsylvania Railroad when Alexander J. Cassatt resigned after he was passed over for the presidency. Cassatt thought that he should have been president. He did become president later. He became Pennsylvania Railroad's 7th president in 1899. His younger sister, of course, is Mary Cassatt, one of the masters of impressionistic painting. She's buried in Paris. Among women, she's probably second only to this woman, Cecilia Bow. Cecilia Bow is interred at Laurel Hill East in the Summit section. I will come back briefly to the Bow family plot. I could easily spend an hour just talking about the Bow family plot. That is a rabbit hole that we will not go down today. Oh, and there is a podcast about Cecilia Bow. I keep forgetting to mention that when I see the numbers pop up like that. In 1877, Thomas Alexander Scott took over as the 4th president of Pennsylvania Railroad, but he cut wages, and that led to strikes that same year that he took over. This is about the property that he built. This is an article in the Lancaster New Era. There's a nice description of the Edmund Smith property, 65 acres, 13 acres of ornamented lawn, 10 acres of fine woodland, 2 brick buildings is erected to furnish the supply of water. Edmund Smith kept his office in the Bullitt Building. It's at 141 South 4th Street, also known as the 4th Street National Bank. It was named for John Christian Bullitt, who wrote the Philadelphia City Charter. Bullitt was also the founder of the firm Drinker, Biddle, and Reith. He has a statue outside of City Hall, and he's interred at Laurel Hill East in Section P. So we circle back to Cecilia Bow here, because this is John Christian Bullitt's grandson, William Christian Bullitt Jr. He was married to Cecilia Bow's niece, Amy Ernesta Drinker Bullitt Bow Barlow, for a few years. You'll have to listen to the podcast to find out how Ernesta got the nickname Commando Mary. But she's a fascinating woman, a beautiful woman also. She turned down more than 50 marriage proposals before she was 21. She took Rockwell Kent as a lover. Anyway, interesting story, but she was Cecilia Bow's niece. Also in that plot is this man, Henry Sandwith Drinker, of the Drinker, Biddle, and Reith. I also love his inscription on the stone: "The day shall not be up so soon as me to try the fair adventure of tomorrow." So Edmund Smith retired from Pennsylvania Railroad 1888. He lived out his last years at Stoneleigh. By the end of the 19th century, the Pennsylvania Railroad was the largest privately owned business corporation in the world. In 1914, it employed more than 200,000 people, which is more than twice the number of people, more than twice the number of soldiers in the U.S. Army during the Great War. In 1895, while he was in New York on business for Union Trust Company, he had a massive stroke and he died. That's when he was buried at Laurel Hill East. Now, this 1881 regional map, he had 65 acres for his Stoneleigh estate. His nearest neighbor was Joseph Eddy Gillingham and his 287-acre estate, Claremont. Gillingham was president of various street railroads. He was manager of the Pennsylvania Hospital, director of Bell Telephone, etc. Claremont, by the way, is actually 10 acres bigger than Laurel Hill East and Laurel Hill West combined. Claremont, of course, later passed on to Morris Clothier, and we'll talk more about him later. Gillingham is interred at Laurel Hill East in the south section. Okay, now we're going to talk about the architect, Frank Miles Day. Everybody loves Frank Miles Day. He's buried in a rather odd place in Laurel Hill West. This is actually the back entrance to Laurel Hill West. The pet cemetery is over here. The conservatory is way up here. The funeral home's way out here. And he's buried here in this little section called Rockland. Here he is as a young man. This is where he studied architecture at the University of Pennsylvania in what was called the Town Building. John Henry Town was a mechanical engineer, and he is buried at Laurel Hill East. Town's partner was Samuel von Merrick. I told you he was going to pop up again. At age 27, Day got this plum job of designing the Art Club of Pennsylvania. It was built in 1896. I'm sorry, it was at 220 South Broad Street. It was torn down in 1975, but it got him another job. It got him the job of building Houston Hall at the University of Pennsylvania in 1896. This was the first student union on a U.S. college campus. Houston Hall was named for Henry R. Houston. Henry R. Houston was a worker for Pennsylvania Railroad. He had been hired by Colonel William Patterson in 1851 to establish and operate the company's freight business, and he became very wealthy. He essentially invented Chestnut Hill. This is the guy who built Chestnut Hill pretty much from scratch. And he lived at Drewim Moor. And I know I'm not pronouncing the Irish properly there, but that was designed by the Hewitt brothers. Henry's son, for whom the union is named, died in Europe less than a year after he graduated from Penn, but not before he had his portrait painted by Cecilia Beaux. Unfortunately, neither of them is at Laurel Hill. Next up, this is his next gig, was the Penn Museum. This massive project was under the direction of university president Dr. William Pepper, who also was the founder of the Free Library of Philadelphia. William Pepper married into the Sargent family, so Dr. Pepper was married to Frances Sargent Pepper. It is Dr. Pepper's statue that greets you on the landing between the first and second floor at the Free Library of Philadelphia. The other person essential to the finding of the Penn Museum is this lady, Sarah York Stevenson, who Beth can tell you about. Beth was a trained Egyptologist, and Sarah York Stevenson was the first female Egyptologist recognized in the United States. Self-trained, in fact. Behind her tombstone to the right, up in here, if you can see it, is a tombstone for George Gordon Meade Easby, who was quite a character. He was part of this family, obviously part of the Meade family also, but his house, Ballytor, is considered the most haunted house in Philadelphia. That's actually going to be the next podcast that I do is on haunted houses. You want to hear more about Sarah York Stevenson? It's podcast number 48. Now, after the museum, Frank was asked to design Waitman Hall at Franklin Field. This is Waitman Hall with Franklin Field, which he did not build. William Waitman, who supplied the money for this, was the quinine king. Quinine was one of the very few medicines in the 19th century that actually worked. When he died in 1904, his daughter Anne became the richest woman in the world. There's a wonderful story about how Anne financed a Broadway show written by her friends for Earl Carroll, the king of exposing female beauty. he got into a lot of trouble with the censors because he used a lot of naked women in his programs. But despite this musical, it was called Fioretta. Despite it featuring Fanny Brice and Leon Errol, it was a huge failure. And Ann Waitman Penfield lost more than $1 million investing in this musical. I haven't done a podcast about that yet, but I will eventually. In 1906, Frank Miles Day built the Wetherill Mansion, which you now know as the Art Alliance on Rittenhouse Square. Samuel Price Wetherill made his money in chemicals, pharmaceuticals, and paints. Today, he is buried at Laurel Hill East also. His daughter, Christine Wetherill, married Sarah York Stevenson, the Egyptologist's son. And she is responsible for Plays and Players Theater on Delancey Street and the Hollywood Bowl. Now, this is Edith Emerson. She painted the murals at Plays and Players Theater, which are in desperate need of restoration. The last time I was there, I could barely see what they were. I did find an earlier representation of it. Edith Emerson spent 38 years as director of the Woodmere Art Museum in Chestnut Hill, and she was the lifelong partner of mural painter Violet Oakley. Violet Oakley was a member of the Red Rose Girls. There's a group of 4 women who lived together at the Red Rose Inn in Villanova. Now, sometimes people mistakenly think that the Red Rose Girls lived in Rose Valley, which is an artist colony in Delaware County, and home of the Hedgerow Theater, of course, which is celebrating its centenary this year. The Red Rose Inn has always been an important part of Penn Township's. Let me show you how close they were. Why I'm showing you this. There's Bodine's property there. There's the Red Rose Inn. And that's close enough to go borrow a cup of sugar. This is Stokes Poges. Stokes Poges was an 800-acre. The guy who bought this was trying to make it into an artist colony like the one in Delaware County, Rose Valley, but it never made it that far. The Red Rose Inn was about as far as he got with that. Anyway, the Red Rose Inn got its name because during this acreage was deeded to William Penn III, and the deed specifically said, his heirs and assigns forever pay 1 red rose on the 24th day of June, if same be demanded. So 1 red rose once a year was payment for living in the house. This Violet Oakley, Elizabeth Shippen Green, Jessie Wilcox Smith, they all trained at PATHA, but they did not meet until they studied together under Howard Pyle at Drexel. I've done a podcast about them also. They took in a 4th woman named Henrietta Cousins. Henrietta Cousins was their housekeeper, their gardener, their cook. She kept the books. In other words, their wife. With her as a wife, these 3 women were able to dedicate their lives to their art and not worry about all of the other things that you would have to worry about. So this is Howard Pyle, who started calling them the Red Rose Girls. Howard Pyle was interesting. Howard Pyle did not think women should be artists. He said once they marry, they lose their career. And yet he pushed these 3 women as high as they could go. He kind of set up a glass ceiling, and then he pushed them and jammed them against the glass ceiling and maybe let them pop through that a little bit. Pyle, of course, was one of the great illustrators of the golden age of illustration. He's not interred at Laurel Hill. However, this is Arthur Burdett Frost, who is interred at Laurel Hill East. Arthur Burdett Frost was another illustrator who was Howard Pyle's best man at his wedding. This portrait of Frost is by Thomas Akins, and this illustration by Frost shows you some of his style. That's for the Uncle Remus books, the Joel Chandler Harris Uncle Remus books. I did a a YouTube video about A.B. Frost and his family. You can find, if you just go to YouTube and put in A.B. Frost, it will tell you about him and his fascinating family. Well, after they lost the property out in Villanova, they got another angel, George Woodward, son-in-law of Henry Houston, the founder of Chestnut Hill, who we met back on slide 51. George Woodward gave them land in Mount Airy. It's just behind what is now the Allens Lane Arts Center at Allens Lane and McCallum. And the name of the road is funny. It's called St. George's. That's because the girls, the Red Rose girls, started calling George Woodward St. George because of all that they did, or all that he did to help their careers. And Frank Miles Day designed this new studio and living space for them. He had apparently met them while they were out in Villanova and built this space for them. Now, by this time, the women had essentially become family, and they named their new home Cogsley, C for Cousins, O for Oakley, G for Green, S for Smith. Jesse Wilcox Smith illustrated more than 60 books, including Little Women, Evangeline, A Child's Garden of Verses. Violet Oakley was commissioned to paint a series of 43 murals in the Pennsylvania State Capitol building. And then she also became a mentor and life partner with Edith Emerson. It took her about 30 years to paint all of the murals that you see at the state capitol. I'm going on a road trip to the state capitol sometime in the next couple of months so I can re-examine. The first time I went there many years ago, I didn't have any knowledge of this. Now I'm going to go back with a little bit of knowledge and look at some of these murals that she painted. Elizabeth Shippen Green drew for St. Nicholas Magazine, Women's Home Companion, Saturday Evening Post. She had a multi-year contract to draw covers for Harper's Magazine. They treated each other as equals. They grew and they prospered, all because of Henrietta Cousins, who is buried at Laurel Hill West. She's just across the road from efficiency expert Frederick Winslow Taylor and Hall of Fame tennis player Clarence Clark. I think it's safe to say that the Red Rose Girls would not have accomplished what they did if it weren't for the studio that was built by Day and the nurturing they received by Henrietta Cousins. Now, Day was also a founding member of the Philadelphia Botanical Club, along with Isaac C. Martindale, the so-called Quaker botanist, who owned the largest private herbarium in the United States. He's buried in the same section of Laurel Hill West as Day. I don't know why I didn't put a picture of his tombstone there. All right, since we're here, I want to mention the current use of Stoneleigh, which if you follow this, you already know, but I just think this is fun. I told you I'm going off in different directions here. You know that this lay vacant for a good while it was before it was rescued by Otto Haas of Roman Haas. And now it is home to the Oregon Historical Society. Grandson Frederick Haas is an accomplished organist, and he has an interest in historic organs. And I found out just a couple of weeks ago that he has made a commitment to restore the William Edward Haskell pipe organ at Glen Ford Mansion in Tacony. The console for this organ, the first time I visited here, I just kind of walked by the console and paid no attention to it. It's on a landing between the first and the second floor, and it's not that impressive. But this is an organ that has 14 sets of pipes, and when it is rehabilitated, it is programmable. So they have a lot of weddings at Glen Ford, and from your smartphone, you'll be able to plug in, whoever's running the wedding anyway, will be able to plug in what music they want to come out of this organ once it is fully rehabilitated. Now, Glen Ford was built as Glengarry, and it was built by this guy, Charles McAllister, who's buried at Laurel Hill East in the south section in a mausoleum. His estate is what established McAllister College in Minnesota. After McAllister, goat leather manufacturer Robert Forderer purchased the property, and he changed the name to Glen Ford, F-O-E-R-D, a pun on his last name. This is Robert Forderer's mausoleum in Laurel Hill East, the south section. As far as I know, it's the only mausoleum we have that actually has wings on the side of it. It's not the largest. The Diston Mausoleum is larger, but this has got to be the second biggest one. It's also Egyptian revival with the snakes and the hawk and everything. It's a beautiful mausoleum. Robert's son, the leather that he worked on it was goat leather, and he used a method with chromium to treat the leather. And unfortunately, he died of chromium poisoning. But this kid was called Vici Kid, V-I-C-I Kid. And you can see advertisements for it in all the high-class magazines in the 1920s and 30s. Vici Kid was the top leather being made at that time. His son, Percival Forder, took over. Percival is interred at Laurel Hill West in a mausoleum with that door on it. And I'm sure you've seen the Forderer Pavilion. He eventually became chairman of the board of Thomas Jefferson University, and the Forderer Pavilion is named for him. Now, when Frank Miles Day died in 1918, it made news across the country. It truly did. He was that well known as an architect. He lies under this stone, rather unassuming flat stone, with beautiful script. I've not seen anything quite like that. There are not many like that in the cemeteries. Now, when Frank's grandson, Frank Miles Day II, died in 2010, his obituary mentioned his time as an activist with the Friends Peace Committee. I'm going to circle back again. Friends Peace Committee was founded by Hannah Clothier Hull, one of the Clothiers. She's buried at Laurel Hill West in the Summit section. Her father was a co-founder of Strawbridge and Clothier. Her brother Bill is buried in the same plot. He is in the International Tennis Hall of Fame. And Bill's son, Bill Jr., was a tennis player and a spy for the CIA. He was probably the inspiration for the television program I Spy. And of course, another one of, I told you we're going to circle back, another one of Hannah's brothers was Morris Clothier, the guy who owned Claremont, and he was an executive with UGI. Morris is not buried at Laurel Hill. Claremont was built in 1916-17. It was leveled just over 100 years later. Designed by this guy, Horace Trumbauer. We will not go down the Horace Trumbauer rabbit hole, because that would take another hour to talk about all the things that Horace Trumbauer designed. Now, this is the Clothier Mansion, Balator. It's in Wynwood, just off Lancaster Avenue. In 1933, it became home for the Agnes Irwin School. In 1962, this movie, considered the best American film of 1962, David and Lisa, was filmed partially at Balator. Now, Agnes Irwin is not interred at Laurel Hill, but the Shipley sisters are. Catherine, Hannah, and Elizabeth are interred at Laurel Hill West. They're just a few feet from the bubblegum guy, Frank Fleer, the guy who sort of invented bubblegum and baseball cards. And yes, there is a podcast about the Shipley sisters. Since 1963, Balator has been a church. It's been the home of the St. Sahag, St. Mesrab Armenian Church. Okay, we're going to take a little break here. We'll see if there are any questions that have come in. I encourage you to help support Laurel Hill Cemetery. Become a friend of Laurel Hill Cemetery. It is an organization that is supporting all the activities at the cemetery. We have tours, we have movies, we've got live music. We got the Dead Milkmen coming back in July. We don't have tickets available for that yet, but they have committed to give a concert. It's just a fun place to be. And there are 8 or 10, well, not that many. Let's say 4 or 6 tours every month, plus other activities. Plus there's a gift shop if your tastes run to the unusual. But let's stretch, get a cup of coffee. We'll see if there are any. I don't see any questions coming in, Beth.
No, no questions have come in. So we're going to take about a 5-minute break to 7:50. In that time, if you do have any questions on anything that you've seen so far, go ahead and pop it in the Q&A, and I will ask the respective person, whether that's Julia or Joe. But other than that, yeah, take a stretch, grab some water, use the bathroom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Last half would be. No chat, no questions. Okay.
The Q&A function can be found at the bottom underneath Joe's 2 moving pictures there. At the bottom, it says Q&A, and there's 2 little speech bubbles. If you just click on that, it'll pop open your Q&A, and you'll be able to type in your questions there, and that'll come directly to us. Okay, the question is, does the Red Rose Inn still exist? Joe, do you know if that is still standing?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think so. I drove out there Friday. Julia, can you answer that?
If it does, it's part of a home. It's been incorporated into
Okay.
a larger residence.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, these 4 women were in a stuffy 4th floor art studio in Center City when they were offered this opportunity to go out to Villanova in this, which is what all the people in the city did back, who had money, who could get out of the city. They want to get out. It's 10 degrees cooler in Villanova and Bryn Mawr than it is in Center City in the summertime. So, they jumped at the opportunity, and they talked about, there was a pond. I don't know if you noticed that. Let's go back. No. Okay. There we go. There was a pond on the property. And they used to talk about how they would walk to the pond and they wouldn't count it in minutes. They would count it in poems. They would recite poems, and it was usually a 3-poem walk to get to the pond. I thought this was a misspelling, this is S-U-P-L-E-E. I thought this was Suppley. It's not, it's Suppley, because we've got a lot of Suppleys at Laurel Hill West. There was a Suppley dairy back at the turn of the 20th century. But no, this is Suppley. That is exactly what it is. All right, let's go back here. And let's see, I can see the questions too.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. William Wayne, I did not I did not do any research on William Wayne. Address of the Red Rose Inn. Back then, you didn't need an address. Back then, you would write on an envelope like Ballytor, and the post office knew that was supposed to go to the Clothier Mansion, or you would write Red Rose Inn. So I don't have an answer. I'm sure that there was a number for it, but I don't know what the exact address is. And do I have a guess about how Frank Miles Day came to design Bodine? No, I don't. I'm trying to avoid stuff that is on your website. That website of Oakwell is just so well researched that I took some things from it, but I realized I could not improve on what was already there. So I just took off in a different direction. No questions. Oh, thank you.
Something about
Okay.
who designed Squirrel Inn. Do you know what that is?
Yeah. Well, that was Day, wasn't it, Julia? No?
No, it's a
Okay.
it's a craftsman design from a little bit later. I'm blanking on the name. If we know a builder, I believe it was an engineer, someone who's actually known for designing a dam in Connecticut. This was one of his only residential projects, and I think it actually required much intricate engineering because it had to be connected to the water supply and heating from the complex, which is uphill from it.
All right, shall we continue?
I think we answered the how Frank Miles came to design the Bodine greenhouse. That was what you were talking about?
I don't have an answer. Yeah.
Got it. Do you,
I
Julia?
don't know.
I might. Samuel T. Bodine was very involved in the Penn campus's development. There's actually a dorm named after him. He was a graduate.
There on the quad?
Yeah. He was a graduate and very connected to life on campus.
Okay.
Thank you.
I don't know how I missed that, because I've got a picture of the quad, because we've got so many people buried at Laurel Hill who have one of those dorms on the quad named for them. I think we've got 7 or 8 people.
And there's one other connection that's kind of interesting. I'm not positive if it's named for William Warden, but at the Penn Museum, there's a sunken garden right in front. It's beautiful, cherry blossoms, and it's called the Warden Garden.
Oh boy. I missed that too. Okay, let's see what I got here.
All right, we'll continue on. If anybody has questions during the second half, pop them in the Q&A and we'll get to that when the second half is done.
Here is the standard photo of Samuel T. Bodine. It's the first mausoleum you see when entering the Franconia section from the funeral home parking lot. In fact, the tour that I give this Sunday is of Franconia section, and this is the first stop on the tour that I'm giving this Sunday. It's a beautiful, well-maintained mausoleum. There's no stained glass. Now let's go back to the map and see some of the neighbors he had at Stoneleigh in 1900. You know, there's Bodine's property right there. The big kid on the block, of course, was Villanova, the College of the Augustinian Fathers of Villanova. This is what Villanova looked like in its early days. This you may have on the website from the 1920 census. It shows that the Bodines had 8 servants and 1 boarder. The servants were either from Ireland or France. So they didn't have an issue with Catholics. There were some Quaker who would not hire Irish or French housemaids for fear that they would try to convert the children to Catholicism. And I guess the Bodines did not have that type of issue. Again, there's the Bodine property. Locust Lawn was Jacob Thomas. I didn't find a lot about Jacob Thomas, except that I know he's buried at Laurel Hill West in the Bryn Mawr section. And then there was G. George Clem, who's buried at Laurel Hill East in the south section. He was listed as a gentleman. He was, in other words, he didn't work. He had enough money that he didn't work. He was president of the Bachelor's Barge Club for 45 years. This is the club that a lot of the rich folks belong to, the Lippincott's and the Burpees and what have you. This was founded by iron merchant Israel Wister Morris, who is buried at Laurel Hill East in the south section. Now, Samuel Taylor Bodine's father was Samuel Tucker Bodine. He was a prominent businessman, director of the Pennsylvania Railroad. He married Isabel Shepherd Nixon in 1833, and when she died, he then married Louisa Wiley Milliken in 1851. This is a copy of the family Bible that I found online. That generation of Bodines is interred at Laurel Hill East. Now, his older half-brother, Frank, is also interred at Laurel Hill East. Sam's first job was with Cohansey Glass Company, which was run by his half-brother, Frank Lee Bodine, president of the Cohansey Glass Company. Sam married Eleanor Gray Warden, the daughter of William Gray Warden and Sarah Wells Bushnell Warden. They are buried at Laurel Hill West in a very nice mausoleum. They are directly across the street from the Methodist minister, Reverend Matthew Simpson. Matthew Simpson delivered the eulogy at Abraham Lincoln's funeral in Springfield, and you have probably driven past his statue in front of the Simpson House on Belmont Avenue. I don't know how many, I've driven past it hundreds of times because I live in Bala Cynwyd. There is a podcast on Matthew Simpson if you want to learn more about him. Now, Warden was one of the founders of Standard Oil. By 1907, he owned 5,800 shares. Each of them was worth about $400. That's far less than John D. Rockefeller's 248,000 shares, but still, it was a good chunk of Standard Oil stock. Standard Oil was broken up 3 years later. William Gray Warden's house in Palm Beach was designed by Addison Misner. It's on the U.S. Register of Historic Places. His neighbor, 2.5 miles down the road, is, let's just say, Mar-a-Lago. Eleanor's sister, Sarah Bird Warden, married William L. McLean in 1880. He became editor of the Philadelphia Bulletin. They're interred in the Woodlawn section of Laurel Hill West in another mausoleum. This is Samuel and Eleanor's son, William Bodine. He was a successful businessman. He was a soldier during the Great War. He was a member of the First City Troop. He's just got the look of somebody who's in the First City Troop. He and his wife, Angela, are in the family vault. First City Troop is another rabbit hole we will not go down. I advise you to, if you're interested in the history of the city, there's a little treasure museum at the First City Troop up on the 2nd and 3rd floors that I didn't even know existed until a few months ago. And it's got wonderful historical artifacts there. The First City Troop Armory is very easy to find. You take the Vine Street Expressway to 23rd Street, you go south, it's the first castle on the right. This is William's wife, Angela Richardson Forney Bodine, and my ears perked up when I saw this. I said, I wonder if she's related, and I found out that she was related to Brigadier General James Forney, a Marine. Well, he was not a general during the Civil War. He worked his way up, but he did become a brevet general in the Marines, and his father. And he's buried in the Marlborough section of Laurel Hill West. He was commander of the Marine Barracks in Portsmouth during the Spanish-American War. But his father, And Angela's grandfather is this guy, is one of my favorite people at Laurel Hill West. This is John W. Forney. He was a friend of James Buchanan. He's the only person who ever served as clerk of the United States House of Representatives, which he did from 1851 through 56, and again in 1860 and 61. And then he was also Secretary of the United States Senate from 1861 through 1868. Fascinating character. While he was Secretary of the Senate, he kept a bottle of whiskey at his desk, so he had frequent visitors. You've heard the story probably about how Vice President Andrew Johnson showed up drunk for his inauguration. It's because he and Forney were out drinking the night before. And then when Johnson had a bit of a hangover the next morning, he took a hair of the dog cure from Mr. Forney before he gave his acceptance speech. Forney is, the whole story of Forney is absolutely fascinating. I do a members only podcast twice a year. If you're a member of the Friends of Laurel Hill, one of the bonuses is you get 2 bonus podcasts. And one of the bonus podcasts I did was on John W. Forney. Now, Forney worked for the Texas and Pacific Railroad for a while, and he helped bring rails through a town near Dallas that was called Brooklyn. When Brooklyn applied for a post office, they found that there was another town in Texas with the same name. So they rewarded their friend John by naming the city after him. I lived in Dallas for 3 years, from 79 to 82. And my wife and I used to drive to Forney because it's the antique capital of the state of Texas. And they've got some beautiful Victorian mansions there. Not as many as Waxahachie, but still. And one of Forney's newer residents, get ready for this, is Miss Stephanie Clifford. You probably know her better as Stormy Daniels. She took her settlement, or she took her payout from the president. She bought a horse ranch in Forney, Texas, which is where she now lives. Now, the Bodine's daughter, Eleanor Gray Bodine, married William Graves Perry. He was a veteran of the Great War. She divorced him in 1934. But for 25 years, this guy served as the chief architect for Williamsburg. Eleanor is in the family vault. When I talk about supplying gas to a city, Baltimore was ahead of us on this. Baltimore first put gas lights in the Peel Museum. Now, there was a Peel Museum in Philadelphia. In fact, it was on the upper floor of what's now Independence Hall. That was Peel Museum. But then they moved it to Baltimore, and that was the first building in the United States to have gas-operated lights. One of the people spearheading development of the gas company for Philadelphia was our friend Samuel Vaughn Merrick, a co-founder of Pennsylvania Railroad. I told you he was all over the place. Now, natural gas was known. There were pockets of it around the country, but the gas used by Philadelphia was made of as part of processing coal. I'm getting ahead of myself here. This is the first gas works. It was set up on Market Street in 1835. That's the year before Laurel Hill East opened. Remember that Philadelphia was only about 2 square miles at this time. This is before the consolidation. The guy who came up with the method of making natural gas from coal in a cheap and efficient manner was this fellow, Thaddeus Sobieski Constantine Lowe. Civil War historians know who Thaddeus Lowe was. Not only was he a pioneer in gas production, he was an aeronaut. He would float balloons up so he could follow troops on the battlefield. And that's what he's best known for. He essentially is the father of the United States Air Force. This is the invention that he came up with to recover gas from coal. And for a while, Thaddeus Lowe lived in Norristown. The Thaddeus Lowe house is still there. It's apartments. It's divided into apartments. He's buried in California, but his son, Thaddeus Jr., married Florence Dobbins, who is the daughter of Richard James Dobbins, who's buried at Laurel Hill East. Richard Dobbins was a builder. Richard's daughter and Thaddeus' son had a daughter whom they named Florence Leontine Dobbins Lowe. She grew up to become a stunt pilot, and she appeared in movies by Howard Hughes. She married an itinerant preacher named Barnes, and she acquired the nickname Pancho. So this is Pancho Barnes. She used the Dobbins money when her grandmother died. Her grandmother's buried in the mausoleum at Laurel Hill East. She used that money to buy Pancho's Guest Ranch Hotel and a Happy Bottom Writing Club just outside of Edwards Air Force Base in Southern California. You might know Pancho if you've read the book, The Right Stuff, if you've seen the movie, The Right Stuff. You know how all of the test pilots would go to Pancho's bar and celebrate. And there was a movie made about her starring Valerie Bertinelli. Now, this is the building built by Dobbins. On a clear day, it's wonderful. You can stand on the porch of his mausoleum and look downriver, and you can see Memorial Hall downriver. Now, since I mentioned Memorial Hall, I'm going to mention a couple of other things. I want to tell you about John Baird, who is one of the top marble and monument workers in the city. He had a showroom on Ridge above Spring Garden. He supplied the marble for the U.S. Capitol building, and his older brother Matthew was in charge of the Baldwin Locomotive Works. Matthew is also buried at Laurel Hill East, as is John, as you see here. John Baird is also the man who contracted to build that large representation of the Centennial Exposition you can now see in the basement of the Please Touch Museum, Memorial Hall. I also think it's ironic that the King of Marble has a gravestone that's carved out of granite. Now, since we're at Memorial Hall, I'm also going to mention Robert H. Gratz. Gratz also has an Egyptian revival mausoleum at Laurel Hill East. He made his money selling canteens to the Union Army during the Civil War. While he's vacationing in Vienna, he heard a rumor that there were two large statues that were built for the Vienna Opera House that were going to go back to the smelter because they were the wrong size. So he bought them and he shipped them back to the United States. And this is after the Centennial Exposition, and he didn't know what was going to happen to them, but they ended up right there in front of Memorial Hall. Those are the statues that were on the Vienna Opera House roof until Gratz bought them and sent them back. There's a close-up of one of them. I'm also going to mention his great-grandson, Louis Gratz Fell, because this is just so bizarre. He was a coal magnate. He was a Florida yachtsman. At age 69, after 3 failed marriages, he wed a 20-year-old drifter named Aileen, but he had the marriage annulled a few weeks later after she beat him with his own cane. Aileen was, of course, the serial killer, Aileen Wuornos, who was executed in 2002. Samuel and Eleanor were also big fans of Mercer tiles out of the Moravian pottery and tile works. Henry Chapman Mercer is not interred at Laurel Hill, but his tile work is extensively featured at the State Capitol building in Harrisburg, where all of the Violet Oakley murals are located. And this was built by Philadelphia architect Joseph Miller Houston. Joseph Miller Houston is at Laurel Hill West. I did a podcast about him recently. He also built his homestead, Oaks Cloister, on Wissahickon Avenue in Germantown. Oaks Cloister was rescued by a friend of mine, actually, another ER doc, a guy named Dr. Russ Harris. He's a member of the Friends of Laurel Hill, and we've actually used the cloister for fundraising events. Now, story of developing Philadelphia Gas Works is very complex, and I'm going to save a lot of the detail. I'm going to save most of the detail for an upcoming podcast. But this is the guy who was the head of the gas ring. This is James McManus, who is buried in a very nice mausoleum on Millionaires Row. If you look over his left, that's George W. Childs, the guy who invented Wayne, Pennsylvania. Over here is one of the Lippincott's, one of the sons of Joshua Lippincott of the publishing company. But I will tell you that there are 152 Lippincotts between the two cemeteries. They struggled to say nice things about McManus when he died, but they did manage to say nice things. But he was a thief. He was in charge of what was called the Gas House Gang that was trying to control the gas in the city. He was fought by Henry Charles Lee, a medieval historian who's buried at Laurel Hill East, with a grave marker that was done by Alexander Sterling Calder. Alexander Milne Calder did William Penn, all the statues on City Hall. Alexander Sterling Calder is probably best known for the Swan Fountain, the Three Rivers Fountain. Next time you go to the Museum of Art, Philadelphia Museum of Art, last time I was there, you couldn't do this because they were blocking the front windows for some reason. But go partway up the steps that lead to the St. Gaudens statue of Diana the Huntress, and then turn around, look out the window down the Benjamin Franklin Parkway. And there you will see William Penn, done by Alexander Milne Calder. And there you will see the Swan Fountain, done by his son, Alexander Sterling Calder. And then if you look up at the ceiling, you will see the world's largest mobile, which was done by the grandson, Sandy Calder. Sterling and Milne are buried at Laurel Hill West in the Pencoid section. And the last I heard, they've broken ground on the new museum for Sandy Calder, which is going to be, looks like about midway between his father's Swan Fountain and his Ghost. By the way, Ghost was originally built for a church in Cincinnati, and it was too big. They couldn't use it. And so the original name really was Holy Ghost. So you got the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost if you look down the parkway there. There's just too much information to tell you about the entire history of PGW UGI. It would take another 45 minutes or longer. That's why I'm going to save it for a podcast. But it does include robber barons like Thomas Dolan, who's buried at Laurel Hill East down by the river, yet another Egyptian revival. And Peter A.B. Widener, the butcher boy turned traction magnet, capitalist art collector who lost a son and a grandson on the RMS Titanic. And William Lukens Elkins, grocer turned traction magnet and adventure capitalist. And Widener and Elkins' silent partner that very few people talk about, George A. Hune, whose second wife and daughter spent down more than $10 million of his fortune. They pretty much spent him dry. And I've not been able to figure out whether this is ironic or not, but on the base of George A. Hune's tombstone, it says yours and mine. There is a podcast about the daughter, Bobo Hune. She's not buried at Laurel Hill. I did a mid-pandemic podcast called She's Not There, about 3 interesting women who were not buried at Laurel Hill, but still had good stories. One of them was Pancho Barnes. One of them was Bobo Hune. And then the third one was Princess Olga Trebetskoy. Long Russian name. It's a fascinating story, but you can listen to their story from podcast number 15. Guess who started the gas company? There he is again, under the guidance of Samuel V. Merrick. Once others showed that it could make a profit, the city took it over in 1841, but it was corrupt from almost day one. The gas trust was an autocratic power. It was impervious to political influence. It was McManus who ran things. It was a machine like the Boss Tweed Ring in New York City, the Gas House Gang in St. Louis. And the big thing it controlled was patronage. It controlled between 800 and 2,000 jobs. And all of those employees were expected not only to vote for the Republicans, but they were supposed to get other people to the polls to vote for the Republicans on election day. So when UGI, United Gas Improvement, was formed in 1882, 28-year-old Samuel Bodine was made secretary treasurer. He was talked into the job by his soon-to-be father-in-law, William Worden. From what I can see, he was definitely one of the good guys. He was not one of these money grubbers like McManus and Dolan and Widener and Elkins. He was on the up and up. And as you can see, he worked his way through the company of UGI, starting as secretary treasurer and ending up as chairman of the board. And to do this, he had to battle some of the most corrupt politicians in the country, like Matthew Quay, who was in the U.S. Senate for several years. Boyce Penrose, who's buried at Laurel Hill East in the South section. The stories about Boyce Penrose are just staggering. I've done a podcast about the Penrose brothers. Penrose was interesting in that he was crooked, but he never kept a penny for himself. He took in the money and he used it to buy more influence. He didn't like people watching him eat. He used to, when he'd go to a fancy restaurant, he'd have them put a screen up around him, and then he would sit there and eat like 2 turkeys and drank 4 bottles of claret. Just amazing stories about him. Izzy Durham was another one who served as state senator. And these are the people that Sam Bodine was struggling against to keep UGI on the up and up. The Republicans ran city politics for more than 70 years. From the end of the Civil War until 1951. Now, since 1951, no Republican has been elected mayor. This is a picture of the 1872 Republican National Convention. I don't know if you've noticed on the front of the Academy of Music, there's a plaque that says, U.S. Grant was nominated for 2nd term during the Republican National Convention at the Academy of Music in 1872. The architect for that, by the way, was Napoleon Lebrun, who, of course, is buried at Laurel Hill East. The biggest gas crook in the country was a guy named John Edward Addicks, whose nickname was literally Gas Addicks. But he, after making a lot of money in the gas industry, not in Philadelphia, he couldn't crack the McManus ring. He made his money in New England, mostly in Delaware. And then he spent several years trying to buy a Senate seat in Delaware. And he messed up the system in Delaware so badly that Delaware actually went without a senator for several years because of the battles that Addicks was having with one of the DuPonts. You can hear about that on the podcast also. So the last Democratic mayor of Philadelphia until 1851 was this guy, Samuel King. Now, he did one really good thing. He was responsible for arranging public baths for the working class. William Burns Smith was impeached for corruption, but he was not removed from office. He's not buried at Laurel Hill. He's at Mount Moriah. Edwin Fittler founded the largest cordage company in the United States. Cordage is rope. And, back when all of the shipping was done by ships, they needed rope. So he made a lot of money making rope. He has the tallest monument at Laurel Hill East. And yes, Fittler Square is indeed named to him. He's also great-grandfather to Happy Rockefeller. Edwin Stewart was Pennsylvania governor from 1907 to 1911. This guy was no nonsense. This is a guy who had the city treasurer arrested, and he fired the public safety director for accepting bribes. And while he was governor, He actually got the state capitol architect, Joseph Miller Houston, whom I told you about before, who's buried at West, charged with corruption. And Houston spent 6 months at Eastern State Penitentiary. He was found guilty of corruption in building the state capitol. He is the namesake for Stuart Hall at Penn State. The next mayor he had to fight, this is as Wally's second vice president, Charles Warwick. Warwick actually beat Boyce Penrose for mayor, but he tried to get the state capitol moved back to Philadelphia. In 1899, while Sam Bodine was second vice president, the UGI building opened on North Broad Street. Then we come to Stars and Stripes, old Sam Ashbridge. He was probably the most corrupt mayor in the city's history, and that's saying something. But he was $40,000 in debt when he was elected in 1899, and when he died in 1906, he was worth about $500,000. He actually told a confidant, he said, "I've been elected mayor of Philadelphia. I have 4 years to serve. I have no further ambitions. I want no other office when I am out of this one, and I shall get out of this office all there is in it for Samuel H. Ashbridge." He's buried at Laurel Hill West in a rather simple plot. John Weaver was on vacation when the city council passed a bill to lease the city's natural gas works to the United Gas Improvement Company for 75 years. John Rayburn is buried at Laurel Hill East, relatively uneventful term in office. This was one of the reform mayors that came in. He was still Republican, but he was a reform Republican. His name was Rudolph Blankenberg, but everybody called him Old Dutch Cleanser. He was born in Germany. He was very much anti-corruption. Thomas B. Smith, while he was mayor, was indicted for conspiracy to commit murder when a police officer was shot and killed, breaking up a riot between William Vare's machine and Boyce Penrose's machine. He was acquitted of the charge of murder, though. J. Hampton Moore rose from city clerk and city treasurer to become mayor. Teddy Roosevelt made him the first chief of the Bureau of Manufacturers at the Department of Commerce and Labor. He's buried at Laurel Hill West in the Bryn Mawr section. And then there was W. Freeland Kendrick while Sam was president of UGI. This is in the middle of the Prohibition, and Kendrick and recruited Smedley Butler to keep liquor not only out of the poor people's hands, but out of the rich people's hands. So they had raids at the Bellevue, the Ritz, the Union League, other places where upper classes met. Smedley Butler did a good enough job, but he annoyed enough people. They only lasted about a year. Smedley Butler, if you don't know, by the way, was a Marine general who actually was awarded not one, but 2 medals of honor. And while he was serving in the city, he put the fear of God into a lot of people. If you go through the north entrance to City Hall, there's a plaque for Smedley Butler commemorating the time he spent as Director of Public Safety in Philadelphia. While Sam was chairman of the board, this is Harry Mackey. He won the U.S. Senate race in 1926, but he was never seated after a 3-year inquiry into campaign spending and voter fraud. So to stay honest, the way that Samuel Bodine did is amazing, because he was working under and with so many corrupt politicians. And by the way, after he didn't get seated in the Senate, he ran for mayor and he was elected mayor. Remember what Lincoln Steffens said about Philadelphia: corrupt but contented. That's what he called the city of Philadelphia. I will mention, this is after Sam died, but I thought it was interesting. There was S. Davis Wilson. He was still a Republican, but to become elected, he had to defeat Olympic gold medalist John Kelly Jr. to take the position. Some other peripheral characters in the UGI story. Ham Diston, who took over the Diston Saw Company after his father Henry died. Ham lost several $1 million unsuccessfully trying to drain the swamps of Florida. Finally, we get a Democrat in here, Robert E. Pattison, the only Democrat to be elected between the start of the Civil War and the start of the Great Depression. He was only 31 years old when he was elected governor. He tried running for mayor in 1895 and was not elected. He is buried at Laurel Hill West. Now, just before Sam died, there was an unveiling of a plaque at UGI celebrating its golden anniversary, and he had been with them all 50 years. He was sick, but they set up a special button in Stoneleigh that would allow him to unveil the plaque simply by pushing a button. You'll notice the typo that he's been involved with the company since 1182. That's pretty impressive. Everyone had only good things to say about him after his death. This 90-year-old comment over here, I think, will serve as my outro, because it's something that you wish you could say about so many people. He said, the remembrance of STB makes you marvel at the desire of anybody to have any kind of industry operated by any political government. Only two kinds of people want the latter: those who have a political axe to grind and dumbbells who don't know that they are dumb. You will notice that when Sam was buried, there's Morris L. Clough there, who is present at the burial. Again, I invite you, become a friend of Laurel Hill. Any other questions build up? Not yet. Become a member today. Thank you for your time. There's my email if you want to get in touch with me. And I will leave that up if you want to do the QR scan so you can listen to some of the podcasts that I told you about. And yeah, 8:30, not too bad.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joe. That was really great. So if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the Q&A, and we'll give it a couple minutes for you to compose your thoughts. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight, and we hope that you learned a little something.
Come on some tours, you'll learn more.
Yeah. Cemeteries really are where history lays.
Like I said, it was a whirlwind tour of late 19th century history in Philadelphia,
For sure.
with as many Oakwell and Stoneleigh connections as I could find.
Thank you, Dr. Lex. That was awesome.
You're very welcome.
Do we have any questions, or?
I'm not seeing any come across.
No, none are coming through.
I have a few notes, if it'd be okay for me to share them, about upcoming events relating to the Oakwell movement.
Absolutely.
Tomorrow night, we have another virtual speaker, Kel Wider from Villanova's Department of Biology and Center for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Stewardship, with a program titled History of Pennsylvania Forests and Oakwell at 7 p.m. And the Zoom link is on our website. While we continue to have access to the property, in-person events are still possible. This Sunday, we have a tour from 2 to 4 of the full property. So that includes the exteriors of Oakwell Mansion, the Tea House, Acorn Cottage, and the Greenhouse Complex. And there will also be a tour on May 7th, 1:30 to 3:30, also the full property. And we'll continue to share information on our growoakwell.com website and the Save Oakwell and Grow Oakwell Facebook pages. There are lots of ways to get involved, and those are listed on our website too. And the next school board meeting is on May 17th, and new voices are needed. So we hope you'll attend. Thanks again for joining us, and sincere thanks to both of you.
Thank you, Julia. Thanks for
You're very welcome.
organizing this. With that, no questions have come in, so I think I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar for everybody. And I hope that everybody has a great night. Oh, we got some thank yous coming in. Thank you all so much for joining us. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and end it. Everybody have a great night. Some more accolades coming through. Thank you so much. You seeing all of them, Joe?
I am. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you for the comments.
All right.
Come on
thank
one
you,
of my tours. Come on one of my tours.
Yeah, Joe's giving a tour this Sunday of Laurel Hill West.
Starting with Sam Bodine.
There you go. You can go see Sam Bodine's gravesite. So the tour on Sunday, it's called Welcome to Franconia, a Slice of Philadelphia. It's at Laurel Hill West. We will meet at the funeral home parking lot, and it starts at 1 p.m. Tickets are available on our website, and we strongly suggest that you buy them in advance so we know that you're coming. And that way we can send you logistics emails ahead of time as well. And all of our tours for the year are on our website that Joe had up, the laurelhillphl.com. All right, any last minute rushes to get something in the Q&A? Going once,
Yeah.
going twice.
Okay.
All right, good night, everybody. Thank you so much. Bye.
Stay safe, stay well.
Mhm.